Thanks, Mary. Mary and Mary. I have a friend who was a very successful wrestler in high school. He was actually in the Utah State Championship match for his weight class. Now, personally, I don't know if you've ever done this, but I've never been a wrestler. And honestly, I thought about it in high school, but the uniforms were too, how do I put this? Intimidating for me as a high school boy to even try the sport. So I asked my friend what it was like, and he shared this with me. Wrestling matches can be up to 6 minutes long, broken into 3 2-minute periods. Being a guy who was active in both football and soccer at the time, 6 minutes seemed like a joke. But it turned out to be the most physically demanding sport or activity I had and still have ever done. You're in a mental, emotional, and physical chess match. Every muscle in your body firing to grapple, defend, attack, and outwit the opponent. Extreme fatigue doesn't begin to describe the full body exertion on display. After matches, my forearms would be so tight and used up that I couldn't squeeze the zipper enough to zip up my warm-ups. Wrestling is a total body and mind experience. 6 minutes is an eternity. An all-night wrestling match would be quite an ordeal. I hope this helps get us a little bit closer to imagining what it was like for a night of wrestling by Jacob with this divine being. So it begs us the question, have you ever wrestled with God? Jacob certainly did, but have you ever personally wrestled with God in your faith? If you didn't through the peak of the pandemic, I'm not sure you're being honest. Never before in the world while I've been alive has something affected all of us at the same time across our planet, quite in the same way as what might be called the traumatic events of the pandemic. And as we're currently feeling like things are more normal, masks are being worn less, fewer people we know are contracting COVID or ending up in the hospital, social events are returning in abundance, and our weekend calendars have filled up again, it's left me wondering, what has changed? Are we just going to pretend things never happened and try to return to the way things were in our lives and in the church? Are we going to run away or ignore the lessons we learned? Or are we going to wrestle with the fundamental differences that we've come out of this pandemic with? In a way like Jacob, we're faced with a decision. Will we live lives pretending to ignore the past, or as Jacob did, finally, will we face our realities fully and try to reconcile the past with the present? I remember a time in my own life that I felt like was a moment of wrestling with God. It was my senior year of college. I was a biology pre-med major, and I didn't have a clue what I wanted to do. All I knew was that I didn't want to be a doctor anymore, and I didn't want to go to college for another 2 or 3 years. So something in me, in my college experience, had shifted through my experiences of traveling to Haiti. My experiences there reorganized my worldview and spirituality, and somehow made God more present to me than ever before. So I found myself one evening finding my way to the chapel on the campus of Fairfield University in Connecticut, alone at dusk. I sat in the chapel and I began to cry. I felt desperate to know what my future might bring, desperate to know what God had in store for me, desperate to know what to do after graduation, thinking I had to have much more figured out at the time than I now know I needed to. I was wrestling. And I remember what prayer I said in the midst of my tears and fears. Wrestling with my thoughts, I whispered the prayer, "Make me a servant." Now, I never could have predicted where that would have landed me, but let me be clear, becoming a pastor is not the only answer to that prayer in my life since. And becoming a pastor isn't the only way to be a servant at all. For me, it happens to be one of the ways God called me, but it doesn't have to be the way God calls you. God has also called me to be a servant to my wife, a servant to my kids, and a servant to the kids I coach at soccer, and the people who ring the doorbell at St. John's. It's not just about a calling to church. I think to get clear about where God is calling you, you've first got to wrestle with God a bit in an honest way, sort of like Jacob did. Remember Jacob's backstory to this wrestling match? He was born a twin, born second. Pastor Frank could relate and tell you stories if you'd like to hear about that. Grabbing the heel of his brother Esau on the way out. His name, Jacob, literally means heel, and it's not a compliment. I'm sure Jacob heard that story way too many times growing up. He's a son of Isaac and Rebekah, grandson of Abraham and Sarah. Those are significant Jewish genes. His brother Esau, much more manly than Jacob in the stereotypical ways of being a hunter and quite hairy, born first by seconds, will get the birthright of the firstborn son. But growing up very close to his mother, she helps devise a plan to steal that birthright from his brother, which he does, deceiving his dying father to steal what was supposed to be Esau's blessing. Now, years later, after running away from the wrath of his brother and homeland, finding success in another land under his father-in-law Laban, dreams haunt Jacob and lead him back to face his past and his brother. He didn't have to, he could have kept running, but he chose to grow up, face reality, be honest, and return to his homeland. Up until this point, Jacob had done a lot of inauthentic bargaining with God. His prayers weren't very honest, but something has shifted in him. He's checked his ego and begins to get really real. He's about to face his brother. So he sends scouts ahead who return to tell him his brother is nearby and armed to the teeth. It doesn't look good for Jacob. So ominous is the situation that Jacob decided to split his party into two groups. In case one is attacked and surely slaughtered, the other might escape, keeping at least half of his family and all he loves alive, maybe. It's with this background that we hear his beautiful and honest prayer to God that comes a little earlier in this 32nd chapter of Genesis and says this. Jacob prays, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, and I will do you good. I'm not worthy of the least of all the steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you've shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become two companies. Deliver me, please, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I am afraid of him. And he may come and kill us all, the mothers and the children. Yet you have said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted because of their number. Amen. Jacob is in the night before facing his brother again, when he wrestles through the night with God and leaves limping. He's about to face his past in a life or death situation with his brother, and he's exhausted. Have you been where Jacob was? On the edge, facing the past, excuses gone, about to really face the music? You see, to be in constant relationship with Christ and each other requires some real honesty, like the kind we see in Jacob's prayer. Author John Sanford writes in his book on the story titled The Man Who Wrestled with God this. Jacob's prayer is open and honest. He lets his emotions come out in his prayer. No pious platitudes here, but an honest bearing of his soul and an open dialogue with God. Too many prayers fail to reach their mark because people do not pray with emotional honesty. Jacob shows us how to pray. If we're angry with God, say so. If we love God, say so. If we're afraid, bring this into our prayer. Prayer is a relationship with God, and no relationship, certainly with the divine, exists without emotional honesty. So are you ready to be emotionally honest with God? I don't think it's enough to just use your head in a life of faith, of being a Christian, and I don't also think it's enough to just use your heart. Being a Christian is really a full body experience. It's more like a wrestling match. It's not enough to come in here to church to hear a good word, sing a good song, feel restored, and walk back into the world to live God's love in the world with a naive smile. To truly have encountered Christ and been changed, you're going to walk out of here to live God's love in the world with a limp. We may not like this, but honestly, truly being a Christian hurts a little. It means checking your ego. It means checking your long-held assumptions. It means fighting your brain chemistry of self-preservation and leaning into the discomfort of sacrifice. It means giving away some of the things that every fiber of your body says to hold on to and never let go of. Things like your money and your time. The fancy church word for this kind of relationship with our life and our stuff is stewardship. But it can also mean letting go of labels that have defined us for so long, like heal or not enough, or even the changing identity of parent. Just ask all our recent empty nesters about that one. Or son or daughter or spouse or good or bad. So I ask, can we stop pretending that being a disciple of Christ is easy? Let's stop pretending any of us know the future of our lives or the church, and let's get honest with ourselves, each other, and especially with God. Sanford also writes this: Jacob refused to part with his experience until he knew its meaning, and this marked him as a person of spiritual greatness. Everyone who wrestles with their spiritual and psychological experience, and no matter how dark or frightening it is, refuses to let go until they discover its meaning, is having something of the Jacob experience. Such a person can come through the dark struggle to the other side reborn, but one who retreats or runs away from the encounter with the spiritual reality cannot be transformed. We are called to be in constant and honest relationship with Christ and each other. So keep wrestling with God, good people. Be persistent in your faith like Jacob or that widow with the unjust judge. I'd be lying if I told you it's not going to hurt or likely leave a mark. But it's worth the emotional honesty. You may just find a new authenticity or who and whose you really are. Amen.